It was August of 1999 when Robert Downey Jr. stood in front of a judge, exhausted, broken, and out of excuses. Years of arrests, relapses, and courtroom appearances had finally caught up to him. This time, there would be no more second chances. The judge handed down a sentence of 3 years in state prison. For one of the most talented actors of his generation, a man once nominated for an Academy Award, it seemed like the final curtain had fallen. The boy who grew up on film sets, the young star praised as the future of Hollywood, was now wearing prison blues. His career was gone, his reputation was destroyed, and to almost everyone watching, his story was over. But what nobody could have imagined in that moment was that this very man, sitting behind bars, would one day rise to become Iron Man, the cornerstone of a billion-dollar empire, in the face of one of the greatest comebacks in Hollywood history.
I am Iron Man.
Robert's story doesn't begin in a courtroom or a prison cell. It begins in Manhattan in 1965, where he was born into a world of film, art, and chaos. His father, Robert Downey Jr., was a filmmaker with a rebellious streak, and his mother was an actress. For Robert, the movie set wasn't a place to visit, it was home. Acting was as natural to him as breathing, but so was dysfunction. Downey Sr. was the first person to hand his son marijuana when Robert was only 6 years old. It wasn't meant to destroy him, but it created a relationship with drugs that shaped the rest of his life.
I think it was 7, 8, or 9, and you know, it's so funny because, here's the great thing, is that the buck gets to stop here, you know.
Childhood innocence was replaced with an early initiation into adult vices. From the very beginning, Robert was learning how to perform on camera while quietly losing control off it. By his teens, Robert was moving between New York and Los Angeles, chasing roles and dreaming of stardom. He was magnetic, funny, and endlessly talented. Hollywood took notice quickly. He joined the cast of Saturday Night Live, appeared in teen films, and was grouped with the so-called Brat Pack of the 1980s. But Robert was different. He wasn't just another young actor, he had the ability to disappear into characters, to bring humor and depth in equal measure. His breakthrough came with less than zero in 1987, where he played a wealthy young addict spiraling out of control. Critics praised the performance, but what they didn't realize was that Robert wasn't stretching to play the role. He was channeling something that was already living inside him. The 1990s should have been the decade when Robert Downey Jr. became one of Hollywood's greatest stars. In 1992, his performance in Chaplin was breathtaking. He didn't just mimic the iconic comedian, he embodied him with precision and emotion so strong that the Academy nominated him for Best Actor. At just 27 years old, Robert was standing on the edge of greatness. But off-screen, his life was unraveling. Cocaine, heroin, and alcohol consumed him. He described it later as like having a loaded gun in your mouth and you like the taste of metal. It was no longer about partying or experimentation. Addiction had become the engine of his life. And soon the arrests began. One for speeding down Sunset Boulevard with drugs and a gun in his car. Another for trespassing in a neighbor's home and passing out in their child's bed. Tabloids turned his name into a punchline. Producers called him unreliable. Directors grew tired of gambling on his talent, only to watch projects collapse around his behavior. Still, people wanted to believe he could turn it around. Judges gave him chances, offering rehab instead of jail time. Studios offered him roles, hoping the brilliance would shine through. And every time, Robert relapsed. Finally, in August 1999, the court's patience ended. He was sentenced to 3 years in prison. For a man who had once been the toast of Hollywood, this wasn't a stumble. It was an implosion. Inside prison, Robert faced the truth. He could no longer charm his way out. He couldn't run from his demons. The applause was gone, the scripts were gone, the spotlight was gone. All that remained was silence, routine, and the crushing weight of wasted potential. Most people assumed his career was finished. And for a time, Robert believed that too. But rock bottom has a way of forcing choices. Some people give up completely. Others claw their way back. Robert chose to fight. When he was released, it wasn't to red carpets or studio contracts. It was to the uncertainty of a man trying to rebuild from nothing. Hollywood didn't trust him. Insurance companies refused to cover him. No matter how much talent he had, he was considered too dangerous to hire. Then came Susan Levin. She was a film producer who met Robert on the set of Gothika in 2003. Unlike others in his life, Susan didn't see him as a star or a liability. She saw him as a man. And she made something clear. If he wanted a life with her, he needed to stay sober. That ultimatum, delivered with love but with firmness, changed everything. For the first time, Robert wasn't just fighting for his career or his reputation. He was fighting for a family, for love, for a future. And against the odds, he began to win. Even clean and motivated, Robert's road back wasn't easy. Studios still doubted him. He was considered uninsurable. Directors didn't want the responsibility of putting him in front of a camera only for history to repeat itself. He took small roles, slowly proving that he could show up, stay sober, and deliver. Then came a turning point. Jon Favreau was developing Iron Man, a project based on a Marvel character that most people didn't even know. The studio didn't expect it to succeed. But Favreau had a vision. He believed Robert Downey Jr. was the only person who could play Tony Stark. Tony Stark was brilliant but reckless, charming but deeply flawed, a man who nearly destroyed himself before finding redemption. In other words, he was Robert. Favreau argued that Robert's real life mirrored the very journey they wanted Stark to portray. The executives resisted, terrified of the risk, but eventually Robert was given a chance. In 2008, Iron Man premiered. What happened next stunned Hollywood. The film wasn't just a hit, it was a cultural explosion that nobody had predicted. Critics expected a standard superhero film, but instead, they witnessed the birth of something entirely new. Robert's performance wasn't simply entertaining, it was magnetic. He brought humor, vulnerability, and sharp intelligence to Tony Stark, turning what could have been a forgettable comic book adaptation into the foundation of a new cinematic era. Audiences felt it instantly. This wasn't the polished perfection of a typical hero, it was the flawed brilliance of a man they recognized. When Robert looked into the camera, people saw every mistake, every redemption, every scar from his real life bleeding into the character. That authenticity made Iron Man unforgettable. It wasn't just fiction, it was resurrection. For Robert, this was the role that gave him his life back. And fans now weren't just watching a superhero, they were watching a man who had lived through failure, humiliation, and redemption, channeling all of it into a role that felt as authentic as it did entertaining. For kids, he was Iron Man. For adults, he was proof that second chances are possible. Over the next decade, Robert became more than just a movie star, he became a symbol. He was the anchor of the Avengers, the character whose charisma and depth held the franchise together. His salary soared, eventually making him one of the highest paid actors in the world. But what mattered more than money was what his comeback represented. When Avengers Endgame arrived in 2019, the emotional weight of his final scene wasn't just about Tony Stark, it was about Robert Downey Jr. The words, "I am Iron Man," echoed with meaning far beyond the screen. They were the declaration of a man who had been counted out, written off, and nearly destroyed, standing at the very peak of Hollywood as a legend. Robert's story is not simply about fame or fortune, it is about psychology, redemption, and the resilience of the human spirit. Addiction nearly ended him. Public humiliation nearly erased him. Prison nearly broke him. But with discipline, love, and an unshakable will to rebuild, he transformed himself from the industry's biggest risk into its greatest success. Today, Robert Downey Jr. is sober, respected, and celebrated. He is no longer the cautionary tale whispered about at parties. He is the example held up to anyone who has fallen too far to believe they can rise again. His story has become more than a Hollywood success. It is a lesson in perseverance, love, and discipline. He proved that talent can open doors, but character is what allows you to walk through them and stay there. You can measure his triumph in box office billions, in awards, or in global recognition, but those numbers pale in comparison to the quiet victories, staying sober, raising a family, being trusted again. For a man once written off as a lost cause, that respect is priceless. Robert Downey Jr. did not just repair his career, he reclaimed his dignity, and in doing so, he reminded the world that no one is beyond redemption. And that is why his journey is remembered not just as a comeback, but as the greatest comeback in Hollywood history.